Warm greetings, everyone. On behalf of W4W Foundation, a think tank instituted as Citizens Collective, we welcome you to another session of Wednesdays for Water. The conversation today is on desalination in the 21st century, solution or distraction. The objective of Wednesdays for Water is to engage in conversation with water experts, grassroots practitioners, policymakers, and youth to explore the complex intertwined issues associated with water and the possible solutions they are exploring or aspiring. It has expanded since then to have more activities like Friday Waters and Monday Munching and Musing with Women for Water, besides organizing on-site workshops, water walks and talks, seminars, special courses, and conference panels to continue the water conversation in various possible ways. At W4W, we strongly believe that water conversations are crucial to move towards water conservation. Do visit our website, www.w4w.in, for more details. Today, we are having a session which is hosted or co-hosted rather by the International Association for the Study of Commons, IASC, founded by late Dr. Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom from the Ostrom Workshop of Indiana University, Bloomington. We have started this series to connect the water workers from across the world and specifically looking at the water commons. My name is Mansi Bal Bhargav, and I'm also the moderator for the session and from W4W Foundation, besides holding the IASC Asia coordinator responsibility. Let me just briefly take you through desalination, because there has been a lot of air, and especially when I'm teaching around in water in across the country, often students ask me, ma'am, there is so much of water. Why can't we just drink that? So it is extremely important that we understand there's so much of water, and that is why we are having this as a first session actually in nearly 300 sessions when we are going to talk about desalination. And as we all know, water is a growing scarcity. And have we enough explored about this option? What are the pros and cons? What kind of things are going on in the world? And these are some curiosity people hold, especially the younger generation with whom I'm interacting. And one of my students today is here as well. So in today's session, we have the honor to have Professor Edoardo Borgomeo. I hope I have pronounced his name correctly, from the University of Cambridge, alma mater as well for me. So I'm really pleased to have our first speaker from my own university long time ago. So before I invite Edoardo for his keynote speech, I would like to take a short brief of his journey, and rest of the bio I'm going to put in the chat box. Edoardo is Associate Professor of Water Engineering at the University of Cambridge. His research and experience span from water system analysis to transboundary management, from stochastic hydrology to appraisal of climate change adaptation options. Prior to joining Cambridge, Edoardo was staff of the World Bank, working on national water resource management projects, dialogue over international waters, and desalination and wastewater reuse strategy. Prior to joining the World Bank, he also worked at the FAO, which is Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations in Rome, and the International Water Management Institute in Sri Lanka. So Edoardo, really deep gratitude for you to take out time for us, and also with you, we are also celebrating the 300 sessions ongoing. So we started the celebration from 290 session onwards. So we are closely coming towards 300 sessions, making it our longest water conversation in the world. And what is surprising is that we are talking about desalination for the first time. So over to you, and thanks a lot for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Matsi. It's great to be connected, and it's always important for scientists to engage with civil society organizations, such as the one that you're heading. And I think it's great that you have reached today the 300 conversation on water. So we'll be discussing desalination, as you mentioned. I'm going to start with a very short video, so bear with me as I put it up on YouTube. And I think it's just a very appropriate introduction to the topic of desalination. So here we go.
Most places, yeah.
Right, and also plummeting resources. I mean,
no, resources will be fine.
But they're not fine.
I know a lot about
They're not fine now.
No, look, I'm not suggesting complacency. We do want to move to a sustainable energy economy as quickly as possible, but we're not in any danger of resource collapse.
But lots of people don't have enough food or water. Water, we will run out of water. They're running out of sand.
No, Earth is 70% water by surface area.
But you can't drink that.
But desalination is absurdly cheap.
Why don't we do it then?
We do it. It is done.
You have a lot of free time.
It is done. There is a lot of desalination done.
Okay,
there's plenty of water. This is not an issue. I want to be clear.
So this is, I guess, a funny introduction to the topic of desalination. It's funny just because, of course, it's Bill Maher and Elon Musk chatting, but also it just exemplifies a broad understanding. It really encapsulates some of the overarching questions that society has around the usefulness and potential of desalination, and also perhaps some of the misconceptions. Of course, Elon Musk is a technologist, so he loves technology and he believes firmly that technology can solve most problems, environmental problems that we face. And that might be partly correct, but as we will see in this presentation, I think when we think about desalination and its potential to help address the world's water issues, we need to be a bit more nuanced, right? It's not just something that we can solve easily as easily as we would like. So we have a few slides now around for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor for discussion. And what I'll provide today is not a comprehensive assessment of desalination technologies, nor a comprehensive projection of where we need to invest in desalination. What I'll do is just provide a few trends on desalination investments globally, and then I'll just pinpoint some features of this desalination that make it a different water investment compared to other things that we do with water, such as building dams, groundwater pumps, etc. And then I will conclude by suggesting this is what I do in my daily job, research on desalination. What is it that we still don't understand about desalination that we need to study more in order to make it more equitable and efficient? So let's get started. This is the cover of the New York Times from August 2019. And the title, so New York Times, right, one of the world's most important newspapers, putting on the front page the fact that a quarter of humanity faces a looming water crisis. This really encapsulates the broad perception and reality, in fact, that our world is facing in terms of water scarcity. So the situation where essentially there is more demand than supply. Of course, this imbalance can be corrected or addressed in multiple ways. And one way that people have suggested we address the issue of water crisis is by investing in desalination, as we've seen in the starting video with Elon Musk. And what you'll see, interestingly, is that of course, as you're very well aware, India is facing significant water scarcity. Then other areas in the Middle East, my native country, Italy, is also appearing red, and then other parts of the Americas, including northern Mexico and southern US. Is desalination the answer to water scarcity in India, in Southern California, or in Italy? This is what we're going to try to, and perhaps what we'll try to show in this presentation is that the answer to this map, to this water crisis, is not to say that desalination will be the answer. We need to be more clever, and we just need to say, how do we leverage desalination in a way that is sustainable, equitable, and efficient without going broke? So these are a few data points from Global Water Intelligence, which is a firm based in the UK that compiles and then shares data on desalination globally. They do a very good job. What this data shows, on the left, you see the growth of operating desalination capacity by world region, and you can see that it's growing. You can clearly see that the Middle East and North Africa dominates the global landscape on desalination. They're the guys, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis. These countries have invested heavily in desalination since the start of the 20th century, in fact, and they're also some of the world leaders when it comes to desalination technology and governance. On the right-hand side, you see a bar chart showing again an increasing trend in operating desalination capacity. We're looking at the same quantity here, but we're splitting it differently in the sense that we're looking at the the users for the desalinated water. And so the water goes mostly in dark blue to utilities, so drinking water supply, but also for industrial processes, including things such as green hydrogen production. So this gives you a sense that the desalination is growing. I think it's a very rapidly growing market, and it's certainly a water technology that's going to continue being used in the future. I wanted to spend some time discussing the specific case of the Middle East and North Africa for the simple reason that it's the region where most investments have been done, and therefore it's the region where we can also begin to put together some lessons learned, to begin understanding what are the pros and cons of this technology. This is work that what we're showing here is work that was done as part of a World Bank study published in 2023. On the left-hand side, you see essentially a timeline showing the growth in desalination and also wastewater reuse in MENA. And you can see it's rapidly expanding, essentially exponentially growing in the last 20 years. And then on the right-hand side, you see a different pie chart showing what we saw on the previous slide. Essentially, in the Middle East and North Africa, we have 50% of the world's desalination capacity. So it's really a very important region to study when it comes to desalination. And what we find when we look at desalination in the Middle East and North Africa is that unfortunately in the region, because it started so early, it also has some legacy technologies which are not the most efficient when it comes to desalination. Right now, the state of the art for desalination technology is reverse osmosis, so it's membrane-based desalination. Some desalination plants in the Middle East and North Africa still use thermal distillation, so essentially boiling water. This means that the recovery is far less, and this thermal distillation process uses a lot more energy. So you see here some interesting, it's an interesting fact really, and it's certainly something that the Middle East and North Africa countries are working on to essentially change their desalination fleet away from thermal and towards membrane, which is more efficient and has greater recovery ratio. The recovery ratio is what engineers look at in terms of the efficiency of the desalination process, the percentage of the intake water that is converted into water for use. If we look at the graph on the right-hand side, we see that the richest countries in the Middle East and North Africa are also the countries that have the larger share of desalination in their water supply mix. This is quite obvious because, as I think most of you know, desalination is an energy-intensive process, and therefore these countries are oil-rich and have plenty of energy that they can deploy to support the desalination processes. The interesting thing is that Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, very small countries, these are totally arid countries, and you can see that almost all of their water supply actually comes from desalination. So for certain countries on Earth, including also in Asia, places like Singapore, desalination is an existential technology in the sense that it allows them to thrive and survive. For much larger countries in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in other parts of the world, and I'm thinking of places like Morocco, Iran, and Iraq, desalination will be increasingly important, but it's unlikely that it's going to cover the entire needs, the entire water needs, because these countries can also rely on natural water resources for their water supply. Now, the message from this slide is, of course, it's essentially the underlying message here is that perhaps desalination is something that is only viable for wealthy countries. The price of desalination is declining, and it's now really competitive with traditional water sources, such as groundwater or surface water withdrawals. The cost of abstracting water from a deep groundwater well is probably higher than the cost of desalinating water, at least in certain parts of the world, where the cost is largely determined by the type of, essentially the salt concentration in the intake water, but also the type of technology that you use. and of course the availability of energy. In places where energy is plentiful and cheap, then desalination is really an important option. But in places where energy is not cheap, and if we look at the Middle East and North Africa, a good example could be Jordan, which is unfortunately not as lucky as other countries in the region in terms of having plentiful oil and gas supplies. Then in these countries where energy is not cheap, desalination can be a risky proposition because it's expensive and it can place a burden on public finance. So you see here, water-related debt is accumulating in Jordan and Morocco, in the Middle East and North Africa, but this scenario is likely to occur also in other countries, especially where we cannot essentially guarantee very cheap energy supplies to water. And perhaps one thing that I would say here is that this issue of the price of the cost of desalination is not just an issue of desalination, really, but it's an issue that affects water infrastructure more broadly. So in many places, including India or in Sri Lanka, where I live, there is a need to invest in water infrastructure to either expand access or to ensure that the access levels that have already been achieved, we need to ensure that they are resilient against climate change. So it means we need to upgrade our water infrastructure to reach people that still don't have water, and to ensure that the people that already have water, that water is safe and resilient in the face of uncertainty. Of course, this is expensive, but unfortunately, in many places around the world, the water sector is kind of broke in the sense that people don't really pay a lot of water tariffs, or sometimes when they pay their water tariffs, these water tariffs go into central state budgets and are therefore allocated across other sectors, not just water. So there is an issue of pay for water infrastructure, which is important for any type of water infrastructure, but particularly, of course, for desalination, because desalination is typically a high-tech effort, which is more costly especially in terms of the capital costs, as opposed to other types of water infrastructure, such as groundwater facilities. Now, when people talk, and now we move on to some of the risks of desalination. When people talk about desalination, we often, of course, discuss the energy cost, which I think I've said is now coming down. It still, of course, is not an energy-free technology. It still requires energy, but lots of water-related processes, such as wastewater treatment and pumping, also require energy. So I think on the cost of desalination, we need to be cautious. I think we can kind of agree with Elon Musk in the sense that the direction of travel is that actually the cost of desalination is going down, desalination is cost competitive, and therefore needs to be seriously considered as a supply solution, not just in very arid countries, but also in countries such as Morocco or India, where there is significant natural fresh water available, but where desalination can complement the water supply mix, especially to achieve that resilience of supply that I was mentioning, because desalination is, of course, not affected by oscillations in rainfall. So on the cost of desalination, I think, of course, there are risks we need to manage, as we saw in the previous slide, the fact that we don't want to go broke if we invest in too many desalination plants. We need to choose strategically which ones are most important and how we will pay for their operation in the long term. How do you pay to substitute the membranes, for example? These are important questions. But on the cost, we can be kind of, I think we agree with Elon Musk. On the environmental impacts, which is something that people often cite with desalination, I think a few points to make here. The first one is that desalination is, if the energy used for desalination is sourced from fossil fuels, of course that's not a great idea. You're fighting the impacts of climate change, and at the same time you're emitting, which kind of exacerbates the problem. So solar-based desalination or renewable energy-based desalination is clearly the direction that we should be taking. And in terms of environmental impacts on marine life, which can take many forms, including the fact that fish can be entrained when you essentially take water from the sea into the plant, you can also take marine life and essentially kill it, which is obviously an environmental impact that needs to be mitigated. And also there can be risks when you have to manage byproducts of the desalination product. Any chemical, any engineering process typically leaves things behind. In this case, we leave behind the brine, which is a highly saline concentrate. You remove the salt from the seawater and you're left with the salt essentially. Research is ongoing to understand how best to manage some of the chemical compounds that are found in this brine, which can be a bit dangerous, a bit nasty. You cannot just dump them somewhere, so that requires environmental attention. And then also the fact that some of these in semi-closed basins, this is not the case of India, but you can think of the Arabian Persian Gulf as an example. If you have lots of desalination plants in a sea which doesn't have great circulation, there are not lots of currents, then you're essentially risking to overall increase the salinity, the background salinity of that sea. So there are a range of environmental impacts, but again, as we've said with the cost, this can be we increasingly understand them and we can increasingly manage them. So I don't think environmental management will be it is a risk of desalination, but it's something that can be managed. So now I go on to the topic of the slide. I wanted to discuss something which is related to desalination, and it's a risk of desalination, but it's something that people don't talk about. People say, oh, desalination is too expensive or desalination is too environmentally damaging. I actually kind of disagree with that assessment. I think the hidden face of desalination, which we need to consider, is what we call the paradox of supply. And it's the fact that, and actually to explain it, let us travel to Vegas in the US, which is, as you know, a city built in a desert. So in a place where there is no water. And there are lots of fountains in Vegas. There is lots of consumption, wasteful consumption of the resource, or at least there was in the past. Vegas, to build Vegas, what happened is that there was a huge diversion from the river Colorado, so that the water from the Colorado could be transferred all the way to Nevada to Vegas. What did this do? So you build a city in the desert, you build a very expensive infrastructure to pipe that water from an environmentally fragile river like the Colorado. The water travels all the way to Vegas. And then what happens? In the desert, with all this water, you give people the false sense of abundance, which then incentivizes further use. So this is the paradox of supply. Water engineers like myself have as their core objective to make sure that we balance the demand, so that we balance water supply with water demand. In other words, our job is to make sure that there is enough water to meet the demands of society, industry, and agriculture. However, what we have learned from places like Vegas is that when we bring water supplies to meet that demand, we do not stop. We do not achieve a balance, which is our intended objective. What we see is that actually demand continues to increase, because when you bring in a water supply, people typically begin perceiving water as being abundant, and they use more. They keep using more. The city continues to expand. People keep planting crops which are more water intensive, and therefore you enter a vicious cycle where there is an endless race to match the supply with the demand. Of course, this is the interesting story from Vegas is that then, so Vegas grew a lot by essentially, as I said, piping water from the Colorado. But then at some point, city planners realized that this was not sustainable. And you can actually see this in the graph on the right-hand side. So the paradox of supply is something that we can escape. We can escape this vicious cycle of supply and demand. And if you look at this graph, what it's showing is that the population of the city kept on going up. That's the orange line. But the water use at some point peaked and then began going down. This is very interesting, and it kind of shows that infrastructural interventions have obviously the potential to support city growth, but then that's when the water use peaks, and then it starts going down because in Vegas they stopped focusing just on water supply, so infrastructure-led solutions, which is piping, desalination, dams, etc. The supply side of the equation was maximized, and they said, we need to stop doing this, let us work to reduce the demand. So then the job of the water engineer is no longer to build millions of desalination plants to catch up with the demand and address the water imbalance. The job of the water engineer is to understand how do I first manage the demand to reduce it as much as possible, and then only then we see if there is a need to bring in additional water supplies. Note that the paradox of supply is something that also affects irrigation. This is work from Isha Zaveri at the World Bank. And she essentially shows that when you provide plentiful water for irrigation, sometimes what you do is you incentivize farmers to grow crops which are water intensive and unsuited to the climate where they're found. This can be relevant for desalination, especially if we use desalination for agriculture. In some places like Spain, they're already doing that. You bring in desalination to irrigate crops, but this is actually perhaps not the right thing to do, because in some areas, in some deserts, we should simply not just be growing things because the environment is not suitable. So this is what the economists call a moral hazard problem. And you see this paradox of supply at play in the Middle East and North Africa. And here we really see how this paradox of supply affects desalination. So we said that the paradox of supply arises when we think that we can address water scarcity just by bringing in more supply. So we address water scarcity just by building more desalination plants. Water scarcity is the imbalance between supply and demand. There isn't enough water for people, the environment, industry, agriculture. If there isn't enough water, the first idea is, okay, let's bring more water, which is what the countries that you see in this graph have done, in this bar chart have done. The Emirates, the Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. They all build lots of desalination plants, but what happens is that actually their populations are some of the highest water users per capita in the world. So it means that you're investing a lot in building desalination plants to close the supply-demand gap, but then your demand jumps because these people, these inhabitants of these countries are actually using far more water than other countries with the same level of economic standard, like Italy, United Kingdom, or Germany. So this is concerning, right? You invest a lot in desalination, but then actually, rather than telling people, rather than perceiving the value of desalinated water as being something that required an extra effort to build a desalination plant, use energy, manage environmental impacts, rather than perceiving all of that, people opened the tap even more and therefore generated even more water demand. And actually this doesn't have anything to do with desalination, but I want to mention it because this moral hazard problem in water management was this paradox of supply, this paradox of infrastructure only solutions also affects flood risk management. And it's what flood risk managers call the levee effect. One way of managing floods, one very important way actually of managing floods is to build embankments, which is something that we need to do and we will probably continue doing around the world. But sometimes if you just build an embankment, what you do is that you incentivize people to move closer to the river. And actually that actually places them at higher risk when the next flood comes, because the next flood always comes, overtops the embankment, and then you have even more damage. So on the top bar, you see the natural condition of a river expanding and reducing its size during times of floods. What happens when we build an embankment is that, of course, we kind of forget the fact that water expands and needs its space, and therefore we move too close to the water. Why? Because the supply of infrastructure, the supply of embankment made us forget that we also need to look at our own reaction to the infrastructure, the way in which we plan our cities. We forget that planning is as important as infrastructure, and then we get flooded. Now we move towards the conclusion, but before we do that, and before I kind of highlight what I think is an important research agenda for desalination, I want to emphasize again this aspect of my presentation, which is probably not what you expected. I did not talk at length about the cost of desalination nor its environmental impacts. What I wanted to bring your attention to is this less discussed aspect of desalination, which is the fact that it's a great technology, but as with all technologies, it can kind of give rise to unintended reactions in society. Desalination is something that we want to use to address water scarcity, not to increase water scarcity. However, our experience tells us that if we just put in a desalination plant in Mumbai or in any other city, in Rome, any other city around the world, to just put a desalination plant, what we might observe is that actually demand increases, and therefore the water scarcity will remain unchanged or might even increase. Therefore, what I invite people to do when thinking about desalination is to really think of desalination within a much broader set of solutions that help also understand how society uses water, what is the water used for, how can the efficiency of that use be improved, how can water demand be managed better, and how can the financial health of the water sector be improved. Desalination can be expensive. It's not as expensive as other water infrastructure, but infrastructure is expensive. The water sector needs to invest a lot in infrastructure. How do we do that in a way that doesn't undermine the already weak financial sustainability of the sector? Now, I want to highlight this research agenda for desalination. I'm a researcher, so it's important for me also to discuss the kind of research directions. And of course, I'm an academic in an engineering department, but I think that desalination requires us to think a lot. Requires us to think beyond engineering. And so I proposed a research agenda which tries to look at 5 main areas. The first one is institutions and regulation. It's great to bring in new technologies, but it's the same with AI. If you don't have an understanding of how the technology can be regulated, and if existing institutions can even run with that technology, then you have a problem. So with desalination, we need to do the same. And a water utility in a mid-sized town in China handle desalination plants, or do they need outside expertise, for example? These are very important questions. The second question is, of course, energy and materials. We need most of the research in desalination is still around more energy-saving processes, essentially. So that research needs to continue, but we need to think a lot more about how to then scale up this, what we find in the laboratory. Can that be scaled up more quickly? So I give you an example. Lots of academics publish papers on new desalination membranes, but they comment on their ability to reduce energy use at the laboratory scale, but they never comment on they never say whether or not that technology can be scaled up. The technology that only works in the lab, of course, is not very useful. So desalination research needs to focus a lot more on the scalability of technology. Then a third area is strategic planning, which means that we need to consider how does desalination fit within a much broader story and strategic approach to water management, which includes reducing losses, changing people's behavior, educating people, and so on. And social dynamics and perceptions is the fourth area. You'd be surprised to hear that in many countries, including, for example, Mexico, the government puts in a desalination plant and then people don't want to drink that water because they don't think it's safe, or that there is some perception that that water might be different from the pure water that you receive from the aquifer or the mountains. So there is an important issue there in terms of improving people's perceptions of desalination. And I say that also in terms of the environmental impact of desalination, which in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases can be overestimated. And then an important research agenda item is also understanding if we can use desalination to improve access for vulnerable and poor populations. And then the final research dimension that I highlight here is financial sustainability. As I said, this technology, as all water technologies, is expensive. Many countries, including India, are interested and are already investing in it. What are good ways of investing in these technologies that don't essentially weaken the financial performance of the water sector? So I'll conclude now with three take-home messages. The first is, of course, something that you already know. Billions of people still struggle to access water and energy. Desalination can help, but it will not be a panacea. So desalination is an essential source within a broader mix of supply-demand strategies. Do not trust people that just think that desalination is a silver bullet. And then, of course, let's not forget that, which is perhaps something that was the limit of that Elon Musk video at the start of the talk. Let's not forget that resource management is not just about addressing scarcity or addressing the human needs for resources. Resource management is it's about also managing the risks that come from the variability of the resource. So flooding, for example. And it's also resource management also requires understanding distributional impact. So how do the poor and the most vulnerable benefit from technologies? And also resource management means caring for ecosystems and the environment. So to conclude, desalination is an amazing technology. It's increasingly going to be used at scale across the world. It should only be used within a portfolio of things. When it's like when you invest, you don't invest only in one company, you invest in multiple companies to diversify your water portfolio. Desalination should be applied with the same logic. And then finally, let's not forget that the water problems of the world are much more than just simple technology, require much more than just simple technological approaches. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edoardo, to really present a socio-economic political aspect of desalination. And it is so nice to hear that from a professor from engineering background with a qualified as engineering and talking about ethical issues around desalination. And I must inform all our participants as well as you that I'm already planning a few more sessions where we can also take people through the whole process of what is desalination and how it is similar or different to other water purification process, because this is also another purification process. But I think the major takeaway for me was really this whole addressing water scarcity is bringing another kind of water scarcity as well. And you really put it through the very nice way of talking about it through the paradox of supply. But now let us just take it through further and look at how people look at the whole process. And Elon Musk was a very good video to start your presentation. But may I now invite my ex-student and a dear, I will say a dear student, Vikas Meena, and who is going to pose some questions on behalf of all of us. But before I invite Vikas, let me just briefly introduce him. Vikas Meena is a research associate at IORA Ecological Solutions Private Limited, holding a bachelor's in geography and master's in water sciences and governance, which is where I taught him also the latter course. His core areas of interest include integrated water resource management, sustainable agriculture, ecosystem services, and climate resilience. Vikas has actively contributed to projects focused on ecosystem services, sustainable agriculture, and landscape manager, gaining practical experience in water yield estimation and soil loss modeling. So you know why I have invited him. I'm going to put rest of his bio in the chat box. And may I invite Vikas to really pose his questions, because you heard Edoardo, and it is such a pleasure that I could correct one of my students to also one of my professors from the university. Over to you, Vikas, and you become our, I will say, representative to pose the questions. And This is also a time I invite all the participants to post their questions and comments in the chat box, and Vikas is going to take that up as well. Over to you, Vikas.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And for Edoardo, it was a very wonderful presentation, I can say, very precise and very informative. So I have some questions for Edoardo. First is very basic, but it's important that we know, are there really any specific health related concerns to the desalinated water that need to be addressed when we supply that desalinated water to drinking water for use of the drinking water?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think desalination, desalinated water obtained from reverse osmosis, so through membrane technologies, is typically very safe because essentially reverse osmosis it almost gives you distilled water. The point that then after reverse osmosis, they need to add back some minerals to the water, otherwise it'd be damaging for human consumption. But I think, so overall, I think desalinated water is fine in terms of drinking water quality. What I want to say, I think your question is relevant and important, because when we talk about drinking water quality, we talk about drinking water quality standards, which we can go and consult from the World Health Organization, for example, WHO. And many countries rely on WHO to set their own drinking water quality standards. But when it comes to desalination, I think the standards there are not as, I mean, they could be improved or updated. And also there is a need for lots of countries that want to invest in desalination to think about whether or not their drinking water quality standards actually include aspects related to desalination. Desalinated water has something called boron, which can be harmful if present at very high concentration. So, for example, I'm not familiar with the drinking water quality standards in India, but do they include, for example, boron? If that's not the case, then of course it'd be important to update them to ensure that then citizens can be confident that the waters are being tested for the chemicals that matter for that specific source. In this case, as I said, boron, for example.
Thank you. So my second question is, like, as you also mentioned, that desalination is a very important technology for current scenario, as we are facing water scarcity all over the world. So, but some people also criticize desalination in terms of the environmental impact, particularly in terms of the energy consumption and the brine disposal as a byproduct, as you also mentioned. So what are the most promising technological and advancements or the policies which are prevalent to mitigate these challenges all over the world? If you can share some very successful examples from the global level.
Yeah, it's a great question also on environmental impacts. I don't have direct experience in assessing the environmental impacts of desalination projects, for example, or also just designing desalination plants, in fact. But what I can say is that because the technology has been around for a fairly long time and there is already a lot of experience, there is increasing attention being paid to environmental impacts and avoiding them. And some you'll be surprised to hear that in some places what's preventing people from putting in desalination plants is not necessarily the environmental impact, but the fact that they need to be built on the coast. And sometimes people don't want very large plants on the coast. So it's more of a aesthetic rather than directly environmental issue. And yeah, what I would say is that the state-of-the-art in environmental management of desalination impacts suggests that most of the the environmental impacts I mentioned, including entrainment of fish at the intake and also the issues of brine management, can really be increasingly can be managed safely. Of course, this requires, again, environmental regulation and due diligence. So it requires an institutional context where developers are not just free to do whatever they want, right? Developers have desalination plants. So that's kind of the most important thing. As we also said for the drinking water quality standards, I think there is the science and the engineering that we need to manage the environmental impacts of desalination. The important aspect is for the regulators, for the environmental agencies of the countries where these plants are being built, to make sure that they understand these environmental impacts and that they have in place requirements for developers to follow.
I have one more question, which is actually important. You talked about the paradox of supply. So, wherein increased desalination may unintentionally lead to higher water consumption. So, in that case, how can the policymakers of different countries or their different cities can address this paradox to ensure that desalination promotes sustainable water use instead of increasing the water scarcity?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. It's kind of, I think, the core of my thinking on desalination is essentially what measures do you combine with the traditional investment in desalination infrastructure? I think it's a great question. I think, events such as this one highlight the importance of engagement with the public and communication, which is something that the desalination industry is very bad at, because they just build desalination plants without understanding that actually they need to do much more community engagement early on to explain the pros and cons of desalination. So in California, a desalination plant was scrapped. They didn't build it because the community didn't want it. But part of the reason, I feel, was that the government and the desalination development didn't explain well enough what processes and procedures they were following. So I think evidence and scientific engagement on the topic of desalination is the first step, because then through this engagement, we can, of course, then highlight this paradox of supply and suggest to people that technology is great, but it doesn't mean that we break free from the laws of supply and demand or the boundaries, the limits of the environment. So essentially, public engagement to communicate that technology helps address environmental constraints, but that we also need to consider our own use to reduce it and make it more efficient. So there is one measure to address the paradox of supply is improved communication. The second measure, which is more around engineering, is to actually concentrate before you put desalination on the plate. You start by saying, okay, guys, where is the system weak? Where are we losing water? Where can we improve efficiency, leakage reduction? So there are a range of other things that you need to do before you do desalination. It's like if you have a house, and you want to build in a very nice piano, but then your windows are broken, the door doesn't function, the roof is collapsing. I think there are things that you should fix before you bring in something very nice that will clearly add value to your house, and perhaps in this case beauty, not resilience. Desalination adds resilience. It's not like a piano, but there are things that we need to do in engineering terms before we do desalination. Desalination is great, but it shouldn't be the first thing you think about when you think about addressing the supply-demand gap. And then I think a third element is kind of economic incentives and price, or the fact that you essentially, to avoid the paradox of supply, we need to use, behavioral incentives. So behavioral incentives, which can include educating people, but in some cases also economic incentives. For example, if you use too much water, I'm going to make you pay more, right? So the idea of block tariffs and etc. I think that whole dimension is still very relevant and always important when thinking about desalination.
So thank you for the answer. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Vikas.
Thank you, Vikas. Thanks a lot. And I think I'm going to take questions from the audience now. There are some wonderful questions. I also have some, I will say some itching questions about it, but I think I must respect the audience first. And I will just check Mr. Shishadri's sir's question. Maybe Edoardo, you are seeing it, and if you would like to respond to it directly, that would be nice. And there's also a question from Monica, and I think she won't be able to unmute and speak. So I'm then going to invite Edoardo.
So yeah, actually, I think I see the question from Monica, which is really great.
Yeah.
Maybe I read it, but it's essentially what are the desalination in areas where desalination is used as a primary water source. This can centralize water management and disconnect the authorities and the communities they serve. So I think actually, and maybe I'll put in the chat a recent paper that I wrote on the topic, but this is also an area of additional research. Let's call it desalination governance. And what you're touching on, Monica, is the link between infrastructure provision and kind of power dynamics, social systems, etc. That's great and really important. And I'll say two things. The first one is that some people will actually say that desalination will bring about a decentralization of water service provision, because desalination plants can be, of course, very big, like the ones that they have in Saudi Arabia, but they can also be very small at the building scale. And so, of course, if you have a building scale desalination plant, then that building kind of becomes self-sufficient in a way, self-sufficient in terms of water service provision. And so you actually decentralize water service provision, and therefore you remove a potential level of control for the central power, right? Water is often used to by the powers to control or obtain favors, etc. So there is that actually potential change that desalination will bring in terms of decentralization. However, in some countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia, desalination has been fully integrated. In Israel, it's already fully integrated. In Saudi Arabia, they're moving towards fully integrating desalination because they have these very large plants into an interconnected water grid, which is fully controlled by a national water utility. And so in that case, desalination does contribute to this centralization of water service provision and therefore power that you highlight. So there are indeed social implications, and they haven't been well studied. So this is an active area of kind of social science research applied to water, and it can build on extensive research that has been done, as you know, on other types of water infrastructure, such as dams. And I actually wanted to put a slide in the presentation showing exactly how dams were used, for example, by Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain in the 1930s, or by Mao Zedong to really cement power, right? So you use water infrastructure to communicate power and to affect society. So desalination can also be used in that way, but it can also be used in the opposite way to promote decentralization, because it's a scalable, it's a modular technology, as opposed to dams, which are just big things. Yeah.
Thank you, Edoardo, and thanks, Monica, for a wonderful question. Another PhD scholar. So, Edoardo is kind of participants we have. So, I'm also now inviting Ajit sir. Could you please be very brief and pose your question, and then we take it. And let me tell you, Edoardo, when I finalized you as a speaker, and as you rightly mentioned, people don't so transparently talk about desalination, especially the developers. I went around in my own network to find people to talk about desalination in India. It was so hard. But I hope by now I should be having at least 2 more sessions on desalination. I'll keep it. So I take Chandra and Ajit sir, and then I pose my question. Go ahead.
Okay. Can I speak?
Yes, please, sir.
Okay. Just a small question. See, we on board...
You're not hearing.
On board ships.
You're not hearing it,
yeah, we on board ships have been using... can't hear?
Now we hear. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. The on board ships, very widely, we have been using desalination techniques because a lot of waste heat is available. And so we make use of the waste heat and the seawater available, and we produce a very large amount of water for our requirement. But most of the time we find that when we are near the coastline, the water is polluted with a lot of pollution from the coast, and also there can be bacteriological contamination. So we avoid as far as possible to do desalination, because our desalination happens by boiling the water under a vacuum at a low temperature. We boil the water at 65. It is not enough to kill all the microbes and all the things, because we have to go up to 100 degrees centigrade. So what happens in these conditions on shore when you have water which is contaminated, and we have to deal with them?
Over to you, Edoardo. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Thank you. So I think the disclaimer is that unfortunately I'm not a chemical engineer, so in terms of process technology, I'm not an expert. So perhaps these can also be addressed in future seminars from the foundation. But what I will say is that you're right in terms of essentially the requirements for the intakes. That there is a need for the seawater to respond to certain parameters, and if it doesn't, then that requires additional pretreatment. So yeah, I think that's an important point, and it's just in fact also a risk for operating some desalination plants. There's a famous, I mean, very sad example from actually Gaza, because Israeli forces, before the current conflict, in the past conflict, they targeted wastewater infrastructure facilities in Gaza, which already had very weak wastewater treatment infrastructure in any case. Lots of the wastewater from Gaza went into the sea directly. And when the wastewater infrastructure was targeted, even more flows ended up untreated into the sea. So that was polluted, water polluted with human waste. Currents brought it up towards the Ascalon desalination plant, which had to shut down because the intakes were contaminated. So there is essentially a high risk for desalination plants to, I mean, you have to shut them down if the intake water it doesn't meet the required water quality. And it's actually a very good point, especially in areas where you might have, marine, essentially where your intake is close to another countries where wastewater treatment levels are different, then there is a significant risk. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Chandra, over to you.
Yeah. Last but least, I wanted to ask you upon the spent membranes which are being dumped as a solid waste material. The plastics which are being thrown out, the membranes after the salts are impregnated into the membrane. Is there any study on those dumped solid waste which is being dumped back into maybe the sea itself, if it is close to the sea, and just eyewash the people that everything is good? Is there any study or any detailed paper done on this particular thing? Because this is something of concern. Because the way desalinate, it is like 18,000 TDS or 19,000 TDS going up to even 30,000 or 40,000. So the membrane life is very short. Maybe once in a quarter or once in 2 months, they keep changing it. And those are all running into kilometers of membranes. And they are dumped silently down into the sea. And then the brine is also dumped back into the sea.
Yeah.
It does not create a dead sea in the places where there is some marine life left over and some fishermen living. Tomorrow, will those areas not become a dead sea? That is a concern.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the kind of the circular, if you allow the word, the use of the buzzword, the circular economy of desalination membranes is an active area of research. Or how do you recycle desalination membranes to avoid having to dump them, when they're no longer useful? So I think you raise a very important point, and I think people are researching.
They are not reusing; it is not recyclable. That is the problem.
But I think people are trying to essentially understand if some membranes might be reusable or recyclable, and how best to dispose of them. I think that's an area of research, and I agree it's important. And then you mentioned brine management. I think it's the same with any byproduct of the desalination process. Of course, if you don't have the environmental regulation and monitoring in place, then the desalination operators will probably do what's easier, which is make money and dump everything where people don't see. So I think the answer to the first thing to say is that your question is very important, and I agree with it. And then I think that there is active research in both brine management and also management of other desalination byproducts. But then what we're not paying enough attention to is the fact that the environmental impact assessment agencies, the environmental monitoring agencies don't have the instruments to monitor that people are complying with best international practice when it comes to managing brines and membranes and other things from desalination.
Thank you. Chandra, you are not the last because I'm still holding on to my question. So I would like to be the last person to ask you a question. Edoardo, once again, thanks for the wonderful presentation. I want to just take you with a few lines of what's going on in India and where can we head for. So as you may be aware that in India, we are already using desalination at Tamil Nadu state, and Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh are also trying to try it out. And I would like to bring the point of Monica, where she was talking about decentralization, as water has been always used as a tool for power. At the same time, I want to bring forth the idea of the supply paradox here, and take your example of, Las Vegas, because I lived in Phoenix for 1 year as a Fulbrighter. So I was very curious how they are so, extravagantly using water. But then when I saw your graph today, I know that there has been a change in the way you were talking about circularity of even using desalination in different way. So my question will start from the point where in India, we are right now desalinating around 840 million liters of water per day. And we are estimating it to grow by 4,000 million liters of water by 2030, so in another 4 or 5 years' time. So in that case, there is a possible model of circularity or making desalination more responsible approach to consumption. If we look at the graph where you were showing the water consumption increased, and then I have understood from Las Vegas, there's a lot of reuse of water. What kind of lessons we can really talk about when we are going to upscale desalination? We can take it in advance in our policy and in our governance, so that we produce desalination as a last option. I will still call desalination as a last option of water. And what kind of policy inputs, in your opinion? Because Italy is doing a lot on desalination.
No, I think it's so. But your question is, what type of policy inputs should be provided for on desalination?
Before we upscale our desalination ideas in India, because we want to go almost 4 or 5 times in the next 5 years.
Yeah. So what should be done before we do desalination in India, kind of? Yeah. Yeah, no, I think probably the first thing would be a demand assessment or understanding how water is being used in municipalities, in agriculture and in industry. And then through this water demand diagnostic or water demand assessment, you understand if there are any opportunities to reduce the demand or reallocate water, so move water from one sector to another. I think that's cheaper than economically it's cheaper, but politically sometimes it's not cheaper, which is why governments typically prefer technology, right? Demand management requires people to engage with their own behaviors and choices, which is typically political. Building a desalination plant is easier in that respect. But I think my suggestion would be, demand management, demand diagnostic, water demand assessment would be a first very important thing to do. Then the second thing to do would be to understand if there is any, let's see. Actually, the second important thing would be to understand nationally the desalination industry. What are the players? What capacity does India need to develop to make sure that desalination is used correctly? Because if you guys, if India starts doing desalination tomorrow, I mean, it's already doing it, right? But if you scale up without building your own desalination expertise, technology centers, etc., you risk then really becoming just a playground for international firms that have already had lots of experience in desalination. There's nothing wrong with engaging with the best in the world, and that should be done. But obviously, the long-term plan should be for then the nation to also become capable of managing its own membrane disposal processes or environmental permitting, etc. So I think that's the second suggestion: build your own national desal industry and expertise. And then the final thing is, again, sit down and revise maybe fly by some of your water regulation experts to Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Israel, Singapore, and see, yeah, and then ask them, ask these guys how they're regulating the technology in an environmentally and socially sound way. Yeah.
I think we have to have a lot of paperwork done before we upscale it to 4 times, 5 times.
Yeah. For
And
sure.
And in your presentation also, you really stressed a lot about public awareness when we bring these kind of projects. Instead of they becoming top-down technological, and as Monica was also pointing out, the centralization of whole water system, there's a lot required to be making people aware, which is also one of the, I will say, ethos of W4W Foundation, that we are really trying to make these water conversations very simple and bringing it to people so that people can have these conversations and not shy away from looking at this technology as something which is government's responsibility, and we can just happily become the consumer, which has changed in the last 100 years.
Yeah,
We have
exactly.
water consumers rather than
exactly.
custodians, So I think and you rightly mentioned that desalination as an idea was initially decentralized idea instead of the centralization. But now when we see successful countries, and especially we are so, impressed by Israel, we almost there to copy paste and not look at that there is no panacea. But we will continue having this conversation, and we have to, we are inching towards 300 sessions, and thank you so much, Edoardo, for this enlightening session. And I must thank all the participants here, and I see there are quite a number of people at YouTube as well. So we thank you for your support and encouragement to make these water conversations meaningful, because out here we are really trying to make water everybody's business and go beyond the engineering part of it. And I'm so happy that as an engineer, you actually talked more about the social part.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And the
It was a
engineering
pleasure.
side of it.
Yes.
So forthcoming session, I would like to invite all of you on October 7th, Wednesdays for Water, for a change, as a way towards 300 celebration. For a change, I'm going to be speaker to talk about my own experience of learning from nearly 295 sessions. So I will be questioned by a young scholar that why I'm running this show and why my team is so focused and dedicated towards these water conversations. The session on October 2nd is on conversation towards conservation to celebrate the 300 sessions ongoing. So we have around 10 or 12 sessions to celebrate. And then on next Friday Waters, we are continuing with Meet a Maestro, where we are getting to discuss about from field interventions to policy changes and lessons from Aga Khan Development Network, the global network which works really with the marginalized community. And to do that, we have the global lead, Apurva Oja. So as you see on our run to 300 sessions, we are really trying to celebrate looking at different aspects, as well as looking at some global leaders in the section, and in their little contribution we are going to make from W4W is to tell you why we are doing this. And that's on Gandhi Jayanti, 2nd of October. Do keep tuned to our conversations, and all our sessions are on our website and YouTube, and the website is www.w4w.in. And we are here, and we are already booked for until the end of November, rather first of the week of December. So we know that at least for next 2 months we are going, and we have been already just keeping our fingers crossed for 2 months. If you know any speaker, and if you know anybody, artist, activist, who would like to speak about water and also speak their heart, this is the platform you should come forth as we celebrate the longest water conversation in the world. Thank you so much, all of you. Thanks, Edoardo, and thanks, Vikas, for making time and also asking good questions. I'm sure Edoardo enjoyed, because these are all future leaders of the water sector. Thanks a lot. Thanks, all of you. Please take care. Bye-bye.